Hello everyone, welcome to your next class. In this one we're going to continue from our reading section and move into our writing out section. So last one we spent a lot of time dealing with input and just, opening a file and getting it into memory and maybe to a point where we can do some iteration across it and do some manipulation. So what we're going to do in this class is I'm going to show you the syntax for writing out to files and then show you a couple of different tricks in order to process data to make your writes a little bit easier, because without a little bit of experience and guidance, some of this stuff, there are kind of like better ways to do it than others. So I'm hoping to show you a couple of tricks that make your writing process a lot less painful than mine was when I was learning. So what you're going to learn in this class is you're going to learn how to first create a file to write out to, and then finally how to close that file. This process is really important to both opening and closing when you're doing writes. We're also going to spend a little bit of time like really highlighting and warning to make sure that you know that you are writing out to something that doesn't exist, or if you are writing out to something that exists, that you know ahead of time, so that way you don't end up deleting something that you didn't want to end up deleting. Because when you write, if that file exists, it's going to write over whatever was already there in the first place, and it just deletes it and you'll never get it back. Then I'm going to show you how to do some massaging of your data, some tricks that I had picked up that I thought were really important, that were really useful when doing iteration, even across like database files and things that weren't necessarily like you couldn't or didn't want to use pandas for some reason because it was too large or something. You want to iterate line by line in some tricky way. And then I'm going to show you how to write out using this the basic writing function. You can also use the print function to write out, but we're going to show you the way to do this both for Python 2.7 as well as Python 3. Python 3 has a new way of writing that makes things a little bit quicker sometimes, but I'm going to show you the proper way to do it. It's much better to do it this way. Okay, so what are some definitions? When we talk about writing to a file, we talk about creating a file that we're then going to put information in. We talked about the .join function a little bit earlier, or rather I showed you that these two little things in the previous slide were some of the tricks that we're going to use. So the .join is really useful. It's a really useful function for if you have a list, you can basically turn a list into a string that is separated by some string that you assign. So this is like a really useful function for making a comma separated value string to write out a file to. Because in order to write into a file, the writing has to be with a string. You can't write an integer into a file. You need to write a string into a file. So writing only accepts string types. So having a list is super useful because you want to be able to use it for manipulation, doing iteration across, but eventually you might want to write some of that information out. And in order to do that, one of the most easiest ways is to use the .join function. And I'll show you a little bit of how to do that and the syntax for that. The next function we're going to look at is the map function. And essentially, just like I was saying, you don't have integers that you can write to a file with. You definitely have, but you need to convert them all to a string. There's really like ugly ways of doing this, but what this function does is it converts all types to a string really quickly and easily. So I'll show you how these two things work in tandem together. So with that, guys, I'm going to move us into our syntax section and we can see what this is all about. Okay, we have a very simple syntax section for this class because we are just going to show you the process of writing, opening, and closing a file. And then the rest of it is more like tricks of the trade in between. So I do have the import CSV package here. You don't need that for writing. However, we're going to be using it a little bit in our section. So we have our open function like we had from last class, except you'll notice that, and then we have our, rather than having an R, we have a W, which means that we want to, rather than read, we want to write this information. And this first variable that we're looking at is what we named our file. we wanted our file to be called test.tsv, T standing for tab. And otherwise, it's basically identical to how to read a file into Python. Reading and writing into Python use the same function, except for a slightly adjusted parameter. Next, though, is if you want to write information into that file, you don't, use like f equals write. You write into the object. You tell it what you want to write into the Python object itself. What you'll notice is with f.write, you pass in a string. But when you write, it doesn't default include a line break. So if you want your next write to be on a different line, you have to include our \n, which is our syntax Python understands for create, a line break here, a new line. Once you have done writing, or once you have finished writing, you then use the .close function. I don't usually use any other special parameters here, but you should look through the documentation if you'd like. Before this file actually writes into memory or writes into our directory, it kind of stores a lot of the stuff beforehand. So you need to tell Python to close that file, otherwise everything might not get written into memory. Or written into your wherever the directory is itself, okay? So it's really important to make sure that you close, and sometimes using that finally statement is a great way of doing that, because like if you have a program that's running over and over again, and there's an error, it might not close, and you might lose like days of information. So having finally, just in case things error out with a try and accept, can be really useful to make sure that you don't lose data when you're writing out. So next, guys, let's move into our coding section, and I'll show you a couple of additional tricks. We use the .join and .map functions. All right, everyone, here we are in our coding section. So remember, if you are, coming from a different time, you didn't do the section previously, recently, we are using this data source. Remember, we were using this data source. I'll show you how to do some write outs with that data in a second once we go through some syntax. So remember where this file is and have a path towards it. So we're going to learn how to do a little bit of writing. So the first thing we look at is from our syntax section. Now realize here that I have not set a path that is going, I haven't set a specific path for this. It's really just going to my current working directory. And that's fine for now, but make sure that if you want this to go somewhere that you can see it, I've shown you this kind of pathing before where we've done something similar to this. Udemy Python scripts test, and then you can like write this to there if this folder exists. But maybe you have another folder. Make sure you use the syntax that's appropriate for your Mac or Windows machine. So for now, I'm just going to write this thing right to our current working directory, which is absolutely fine because it's only one little file that we can delete later. And so I'm going to comment this out, and we're just going to see what happens when we run this. Nothing happens at all, guys, and that's a good thing when you're writing like this, because what this tells me is that we didn't tell it to print anything. We actually just told it to put something into a directory. So if it didn't error, that usually means it worked. So great, it created a file. We can it then wrote this line into that file and then closed it. And if I go into our directory, if you go into the directory where it is, you'll notice that it does exist there as well. So the next thing I want to show you is how to like actually do this in a practical way where you actually have a piece of data and you're doing something with it, okay? So I'm going to go through this line by line with you. So the first thing I did was what we're going to do is we're going to take our wine equality data set and just like read it into memory, take some information and then write out that manipulated or removed or selected information and put it somewhere else. Maybe we do a calculation with it. We'll see what happens. Actually, we do a calculation with it if you see this line comprehension here. But that's the purpose of what we're doing right now. So the first thing I want to show you is that what you want to do is you want to create your file that you're going to write out to. It's first step, because at this point it's going to be empty. You don't have to worry about it, and you just like almost like initializing a variable. The next thing you're going to do is we have this with statement that we looked at from the previous section. So remember how we read a file in is that we use our open command. We make sure that we are in the right folder. If not, we have the right pathing to where this data currently exists. And then we specify that we want to read this data. And I'm calling this, with this with statement, remember you have to have with the open location and then as to label the open function, almost like it's an assignment. So we're calling this fin, which is file in. We have our file out and we have our file in. So the next thing we do is now we have this fin object, we have our indented line that's going to do a bunch of operations on this CSV file. First thing we're going to do is we imported our CSV package. So we know this is a CSV file because the people have told us it's a CSV file. When you actually have data in the wild though, this might not actually, like, a person labeled this. So it might actually not be a comma separated value or file because there's like some weird error in it. So just because something says it's a .csv doesn't mean it's a .csv. And this is actually a perfect example of it because it's not comma separated, it's semicolon separated. So in this example, the .csv is not telling you anything. So you need to make sure that you look at your data before you separate it out, and that way you can, like, before you start to do your data science stuff on it, because you're gonna have a bunch of errors otherwise. So the first thing we do is we run this command, which is we use the CSV reader. We looked at it before. It looks like it's a CSV file. There's nothing wrong with using this default package to try and read it in and see what happens. And usually this is going to be fine. But we did know that the delimiter was a semicolon, right? So we pass in our input object, our file in object, and we specify, oh, hey, like this is delimited with semicolons, not commas, which is the default parameter for delimiter. The next thing we do is once we have that list of lists, this creates a list of lists in the end. So what we do is then I convert this into a NumPy array, because if you looked at the file, it had everything under the header was just numbers. So it'd be useful to turn this into an array so that we can just, like, you know, do like array times 3 and it'll multiply everything in the array by 3. A list can't do that. So what I've done here is we've only selected the top, like the everything but the first row. Remember, we have our indexing between 0 to n, so I say 1, exclude the header, and have the rest as numbers, and this is our array in the end. This becomes our data. I can really just call this data array or something like that. But because it's a list of lists, I can iterate across this array now. Each line, each row of this list is essentially like one log of information about wine. So let's say we only wanted wines that has a value for this specific column. Like we only want column 0 to make sure that everything above 7 for column 0. Everything else we can ignore, just like remove that data. So how we do that in Python is we can then iterate across each line and create an if statement, where we say, okay, well, that first column is not useful to us, or it is useful to us, but we only want to parse out, we only want to analyze this specific stuff. So we can just do a simple logic statement, an if statement, where we say, okay, if that column is greater than or equal to 7, we want to do something specific to it. In this case, we're just saying that we wanted to multiply all of those lines by 10. So this would be like, we wanted to manipulate these lines of data quickly in a way that's like not super easy to do in other ways, especially when you have lots and like millions and millions of rows. So what we've done here is we've changed our line to be that entire data set, or that entire row of data, to multiply it by 10 and use a list comprehension to do that. So this is just like a sample of what I would maybe do to like manipulate some data as I'm using an open statement with a with clause. The next thing you usually want to do is once you've done all of your manipulation, your data manipulation, you then want to prepare your data to be written out. So that usually takes 2 lines for me, because I have my list, I have my embedded list of lists, that's what the array is. And now what I would want to do is, because remember when we write out to a file, it needs to be a string. The first thing I wanted to do is I wanted to take my line, my row of data, and make sure that the calculations I did that turned lines that were above 7 to multiply by 10, change all of their data types to a string so I can use this dot join function easily. Dot join will error out if it encounters an element that's not a string in a list. So it changes everything into a string, those numbers included, so that you can then convert that entire list into a large string that you can write out to a file. In this case, we're making a tab separated file. We're saying /t is what's going to break each of these different values in our string. And then the last, well, two things we do, then we finally have our write. We have it right here. We've created our string, which is data out, which was once a list, now a tab separated string. And then remember, lastly, that when we write, we don't have a line break by default in there. So I like to just kind of like remind myself at the end to like add the line break at the end. You could also maybe do it from here, but I wouldn't try it. Once we write out, what I've done here is just, I only wanted to show you one line of the for loop. You can let this whole thing run if you want, but I break out of the for loop just to show that it worked. Once we have finished that whole write, we want to close our file, guys. And it's really important to have that clause there because we might miss something. It might not write to our file if something goes wrong, okay? So let's just go through this line by line right now and run a couple of these things. Let's see what happens when we print fn here and see what that is. So we indeed have a CSV object. It doesn't seem to be that very interesting or something we can do anything with. So now we can also then print, let's also print this part here. Let's see what happens. So now we have our reader object. So first we just had our open object. Now we have our reader object. And if we print this data object now, we've converted this CSV reader object into a list. And look at that. So what we get is our CSV file. First line of our list of lists is our header. So each of these, like we could do a pandas.read and like select these specifically, but our first line is our header here. And then each list in this list of lists is a row of data that we can do some like interesting iteration on. So the next thing I ended up doing was I created an array out of this list of lists, and here you have it here. So now you have kind of like a truncated thing that's a lot easier to manage that you can do like number manipulations on. Anyway, let's look at this here. Let's look at when we finally have a line of data that is above 7. Turns out our first line is going to hit this condition immediately. Let's see what happens when we print this though, and then I want to break here. So we only print the first time it comes out, and then let's also just close this, make sure that's in there. It doesn't error, so like if you don't include this dot close, it'll try and close it by default, but you always want to do this as like basically just its proper form, and if you don't, you might break stuff down the line that you don't realize. So here we go. We hit our first conditional, which is our first line, and we said, okay, if it's above 7, we want to multiply everything by 10, and lo and behold, it did just that with our list comprehension. We can probably also do line times 10, because this might be a NumPy array. Oh yeah, I couldn't do it because we have different data types here. So I use this list comprehension. It's super easy. The reason why is because I dynamically change the variables in each element of this line. But there's many ways to do this, guys. This is just one of them. Okay, so once we do all of that, let's remove this here and bring these back in. I'm going to show you what data out looks like, and then we're going to show the write, and then we're done. Go. So here's our print data out, and you'll see here now it's very large. It's because it's tab separated. Let me just remove this and we'll do a comma separated for now, and you'll see it's a little easier to read. There's a comma separated printing going on here, and it goes through all 5,000 lines. So lastly, what we want to do is write this out to our file, and I'm going to just break here so we only have one row that writes out. But if you can remove the break when you do this yourself, you can see this whole 5,000 line file just like write instantly, which is super empowering and really cool for a lot of people. So let's just see what happens when we do this. We don't have any prints. Nothing should happen. Great. Okay, we didn't have any errors. That's a good sign for us to expect that, like, you know, this actually wrote out what we expected. So with that, guys, we're going to finish up our coding section by doing a recap. Okay, so what did we learn today, guys? We learned how to create a file. We learned how to write data into that file. I taught you a little bit about how to use that with statement and the read from our previous section, manipulate your data, do some, adjustments and calculations to it, and dynamically change its data type to a bunch of different things, and just to see how you would then eventually write this out into a new file in a way that's super clean and easy, that doesn't require lots of trial and error to realize the things that you're doing wrong when you're trying to write to files with no experience. That's the best way to do it that I've had in my experience when you're writing to CSVs. So with that, guys, thank you very much, and I'll see you next time.